Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture, which is on gender, state, law, and policy. I want to first start off with terminology because I want to make sure that we're all working within the same terminology, and I don't want to assume that you know a lot of the terminology that we're going to be going over in this lecture. So, the first terminology that I want you to be familiar with is this thing called social institutions. And essentially, institutions or social institutions, what we're talking about, consist of, broadly speaking, groups of persons banded together for common purposes, having rights, privileges, liabilities, goals, or objectives that is distinct and independent from those of individual members. Meaning that essentially an institution is formed out of groups of people with a sort of common goal, purpose, privileges, and so forth. So, institutions that we can think about, or social institutions that we can think about, is stuff that for a lot of us, we don't even think about it as an institution, like family, right? Where you're connected together through whether that's biological or social sort of situations. And again, having something that is very distinct and independent from individual members, like a family unit, to a community, which broadly speaking, communities can be both small or large, to ethnic or cultural groups, to religious affiliations. These are all considered social institutions. But there are other aspects of social institution that can be more, I guess you can consider more formalized. For example, educational institutions, right? So these are social organizations dedicated to teaching skills and knowledge to individuals. Fresno State, uh, public education like high schools, medical schools, online education, all of that type of thing would be considered educational institutions where they are organizations where there's a structure of individuals, there's laws, there's positions, there's a whole sort of hierarchy in that. So this would be considered a social institution based around education. Of course, something that is very much in the news is around health and healthcare institutions, and there's a lot of things that we can consider part of healthcare institutions, such as monitoring public health, which is what the Center for Disease Control and Prevention does, to actually like hospitals, to medical practices, to research institutions, and so forth. These would be considered healthcare institutions. The one that of course we're going to be focusing predominantly in this lecture is around government and legal institutions. And essentially they're the office, function, authority, or organization that sets forth and administers public policy and the affairs. A government consists of a legislative branch, which writes the law and policy, an executive branch, which executes law and policy, and a judicial branch, which enforces law and policy. And governments and legal institutions are encompass everything from the federal government to state government to local government to city government and so forth, right? As well as including all branches of the military. We would consider these government as legal or government and legal institutions. Another term and concept that I want to talk about is the state. And what do I mean by the state? Because it's often used, particularly in the chapter that we're reading for this week, it's used in a multitude of ways. So, broadly speaking, the state refers to any and all forms of social organization representing official power in society. So, the state can include government, law and social policy, the courts and criminal justice system, the military, and the police. There's, of course, other ways that we can talk about the state. So there's like the United States of America or the federal government, or and then like the state of California. But you can also just talk about the state as sort of the larger sort of speaking in regards to uh, as we say, like all forms of social organization representing official power and society. So you talk refer to the state in a multitude of ways. In the chapter that we're reading, they're talking about the state in both like in regards to the United States of America, the states in regards to individual states within the United States of America, as well as just broadly speaking, the state as this just this entity. why we talk about the state in multiple ways is that, when we sort of start looking at it, the various powers within the state, we see that it has incredible amounts of power, right? The state determines how people are selected to govern others and control systems of governments they must use. For example, that is what the Constitution is all about. It's about, one, how we select, but as well as how it controls the systems of governments that we must use. It also has incredible and considerable authority in maintaining social order. The state influences very much how power is exercised within society. So, breaking down the state some more, it's really important that whether we're talking about the United States of America or the state of California or the state of Washington or whatever, or just like broadly speaking, the state, it's really important to remember that the state does not happen in a vacuum, right? So, meaning whatever happens, in regards to federal policies, so the United States of America policies, to local policies within the state of California or the governor's office and so forth, it often reflects the society and social order of that time. For example, when we look at the history of the United States of America, or we look at the history of California, or we look at the history of Fresno City, for example, or Fresno County, we see that it reflects a lot of different sort of times as well as ideas around who gets power and who does not. So, women, persons of color, poor individuals, persons with disabilities, indigenous persons, LGBTQ plus persons have been and continue to be treated poorly by the state. And we can look at the history, right? Around laws discriminating against minorities, to being banning individuals from entering the United States. We can talk about right now ban against immigration currently, but we can talk about ban of immigration in the past. A good example is the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned Chinese women from entering the country, to literally the denial of the right to vote, which was all of what the 19th Amendment was about. Of course, though, on the flip side of this is that the state has also been a tool for addressing historical forms of social, political, and economic inequalities through law and social policy. It is usually the first step in regards to trying to make a larger concerted effort to change inequalities. So, we can talk about the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s, which was really meant to first and foremost address the systemic sort of discrimination against persons of color, and to really sort of, again, address historical ongoing violence against particularly persons of color. But we can also talk about in regards to women's rights, in regards to Title IX, which is around discrimination on the basis of sex and gender in education, and Title VII, which is around discrimination of sex and gender in the workforce, right? And these were created in order to address systemic inequalities, right? So the state has been used to oppress as well as a tool to create social change and social justice. So again, the state is neither good or bad, but does reflect the time period that it's in. It can be used for both terrible purposes of oppressing individuals as well as a means to fight against that oppression. So, the government, a very loaded term, but let's talk about this. So, the government, and the government can be both broadly speaking across, like, the United States government, to government in regards to California, to government in regards to the city of Fresno. So the government in general encompasses a lot, is one of the institutions that makes up the state. And it creates laws and procedures that govern society and its citizens, and it's often referred to as the political system. And when we think about the United States, we've got a couple of things, and this might seem like basic civics, but 101, but I do want to make sure that we are all working within the same terminology. So, of course, there's, in the United States, there's the federal government of the United States, and it's the national government of the United States, a federal republic in North America comprised of 50 states, a federal district, 5 major self-governing territories, including Puerto Rico, and several island possessions. Thing that we're going to focus a lot on in the next couple slides is around state government, because in fact, state governments, so like the state of California, have incredible amounts of power within the United States of America. One is that they, because of the 10th Amendment in the Constitution, it prohibits the federal government from exercising any power not delegated to it by the Constitution. As a result, the majority of states handle issues most relevant to individuals within their jurisdiction. That means that each state has its own written constitution, government, and code of laws. And all that the state really needs to do is to make sure that it follows what we would call a Republican government. And a Republican government doesn't mean like the Republican Party. It means that it's a government that is held by where the power of the government is held by the people in regards to voting power. The people give power to leaders they elect to represent them and serve their interests, and the representatives are responsible for helping all the people in their country, not just a few people. So, here in the United States, the states have incredible amounts of power. It's actually pretty unique. You know, if you go to other countries like such as Canada that doesn't have states but provinces, their provinces don't have as much independent authority and power, and that the federal government of Canada has, right? So the United States is a very interesting government system where individual states hold a lot of power and control to decide what's going on, what laws they're going to adopt, what laws they won't adopt, what different laws they're going to enforce. To sort of give you a clear example of this, and something that is very much at the heart of what I do in regards to advocating for LGBTQ rights, when we talk about LGBTQ rights in regards to just, discrimination based on sex and gender, it matters a lot in which state you're in. And the truth is that there's incredible amounts of differences in laws and procedures between individual states concerning issues such as property, crime, health, and education, amongst others. So depending on where you are, you may have little to no protection, as this law sort of shows. So California, yes, is in the green in that there are state laws that explicitly prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. There are a couple of other states that maybe include discrimination based on sexual orientation or sexual orientation only. But a good majority of them do not have these laws in place, meaning that you could be fired for being gay. Good example is this, right? So this is a map of prohibiting discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And as you can see, a large number of the states don't even have these sort of protections or have only partial protections, which means, again, living in these states, you could be fired for being LGBTQ. You could have your rights taken away in regards to access to healthcare or access to education based on LGBTQ. Housing is another one that is definitely something that's been talked about way more. Now, again, California is still pretty good in regards to it technically prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, but there are many other states across the country that don't, which means that you could be evicted or be denied housing based on solely being LGBTQ. Education is another one of those where it's addressed discrimination against students based on sexual orientation and gender identity, which means that your professors or your teachers could discriminate you, deny you education, harass you, and you have very little protection or really any sort of means to advocate for yourself because there are no laws prohibiting this. And just lastly, if we want to talk about transgender healthcare, we have incredible wide variance there where, there are, depending on the states that you live in, you could have your insurance ban from providing you trans-specific health care. So there's a wide swath of the country that there are many trans people who cannot get the health care that they need based on being trans. So if anything, what I hope that this little example shows you is just the wide amount of power that states have. And this is just on LGBTQ. So if we talk about issues around women's rights, mothers' rights, and so forth, we see also this wide variance from state to state. So let's talk a little bit more about the Constitution, which is something that is often brought up, but a lot of people don't actually read it. And of course, there's a lot of debates over a document that was written over 300 years ago. You know, in the 1780s, when the Constitution was created, it was ordained and established by men, and as a rule, women did not participate in the conventions that framed and ratified the Constitution. But it is misleading to say that women weren't involved in the creation of the Constitution because women played an active role in the American Revolution. They also were very much formed, for example, the Daughters of Liberty to raise funds for the revolution. They also, very much assisted and helped our founding fathers in regards to the work that they were doing. At the same time, the Constitution reflected the times, right? And who was writing it, which was mostly, well, which was not mostly, which was all white men. So there was a lot of bias within the Constitution. Our founding fathers believed that women's political identity should be restricted because their presence in politics was seen by the majority of them, not all of them, but a good chunk of them, as immoral, corrupt, and potentially disruptive, and that women should be represented by their fathers, husbands, or brothers. Again, this is reflection of the time of seeing women only as property. It was understood at the time that women should be just confined to the private sphere of the home where they would be dependent on men, and as a result, they had in the Constitution, they had no separate legal identity and were legal beings only through the relationship to a man. And therefore, women also had no claims to citizen rights as a woman until well into the 19th century, right? The 19th Amendment, of course, that sort of changed everything. And that part of the 19th Amendment was to adjust and to rectify the fact that women's right to vote wasn't allowed. And so putting it into it as a constitutional amendment, one, changed, the sort of addressed the wide gap in regards to women legal rights, having a legal representation. At the same time, there was a lot in regards to women's rights that weren't reflected in the Constitution. And this is where we get to the Equal Rights Amendment. Because while the 19th Amendment, was precisely about that you cannot discriminate against, or you cannot ban voting on the basis of sex or gender, voting, again, is important, but there are many other institutional inequalities that needed to be addressed in the Constitution. And that is where the Equal Rights Amendment first came up. So let's talk more about the Equal Rights Amendment. So 80% of Americans mistakenly believe that women and men are already explicitly guaranteed equal rights by the Constitution. But here's the thing, is that right now there's only one sort of clause in there around sex and gender, and that is the 19th Amendment, which is around the right to vote. So, while again is something that we talked about in regards to women's rights, that the right to vote is very important, not knocking it, at the same time, as we have now sort of explored, there are incredible amounts of inequalities, systemic inequalities, both within institutions in regards to the government, in regards to healthcare, in regards to education, and so forth, that voting alone, the right to vote, does not fully accurately address. So the Equal Rights Amendment was actually first proposed in the 1920s and then was taken up again in the 1970s. And its proposal is an amendment to the United States Constitution to design to guarantee equal legal rights for all American citizens regardless of sex. It seeks to end the legal distinction between men and women in terms of divorce, property, employment, and other matters. The Equal Rights Amendment affirms that both women and men hold equally all the rights guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. It would also provide a remedy for gender discrimination at the constitutional level and provide legal status to women for the first time in our country's history. Now, supporters say adopting the ERA would, among other things, sweep away discrimination in the workplace, help women to achieve pay equality, and allow men to get paid paternity leave. So it's effective for not only for women but also for men. It would also require states to intervene in cases of domestic violence and sexual harassment and guard against discrimination based on pregnancy and motherhood. It also may bolster protections for gay and trans individuals as well. 3 in 4 Americans support the Equal Rights Amendment. So while unfortunately it has not passed yet, it's been something that has been, very much supported by a majority of Americans. This year, Virginia was the 38th state to approve the Equal Rights Amendment, meaning because it has to be approved state by state. But over the years, 5 of those states, Idaho, Kentucky, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Tennessee, have voted to rescind. So they had approved it in the past and now have been asking to rescind it, which means that while Virginia was the 38th state to approve it, which means that it could go up to the Supreme Courts to get into the Constitution. Several states have now rescinded their approval of it, so right now it hangs in the balance. But this is a really important amendment that many people across the country support, and it's not only beneficial for women, but for men and everyone across the gender spectrum. So it's something to watch for in the next couple of years. So we've been sort of exploring throughout these couple of weeks both the systemic challenges that women face in regards to getting equal access to education, equal access to same pay or the gender pay gap, to things like maternity care and so forth, right? And one of the solutions is said, well, we need more women in office, meaning that if there are more women, you know, being in holding positions of public office, that they can also then advocate for laws that will benefit for other women, having a seat at the table to represent not only your experiences, but other persons like yours experiences. And that's really important. Diversity in government is really important because we need to have a multitude of voices to represent everyone's concerns. But the situation is not so easy in regards to women. Women still constitute a relatively smaller number of candidates for local, state, and national offices, and their presence is greater at the local than the national level, meaning that you will see more women represented in municipal, county offices, and then as you go further up, sort of the chain of command from to state legislator to then the federal government, you see less and less women. As the political office becomes more visible, higher level, better paid, and more authoritative or powerful, there are fewer women in these positions. This is what we like to call the gender gap in politics. The term gender gap in politics refers to differences between women and men in political attitudes and voting. It also refers to a gap in regards to representation of women in office. While women have made great strides in entering the workforce, running companies, getting elected to Congress, there has remained a persistent gap in politics over the past 40 years. To talk about this further, when we look at the United States, we see a pretty significant gender gap, with the U.S. House of Representatives being 102 or 23%, meaning that when we look at representation of women, it's around 23%. So it's not even 50-50. And then, when we look at the Senate, it's about 25% represent women, or women being in that office. Heads of state, about 24 women at any given time. And women remain less than a third of all elected officials in the nation since when we're looking at the numbers of 2019. And a 2018 Pew Research study found that 61% of Americans felt positive about more women running for office in 2018. So it's not that people are against women for running for office. But at the same time, we still see this persistent gender gap. And we see a sort of a gender gap in regards to office type. Women make up about 42% of school board candidates, yet they are the only 27% of all city council candidates, meaning that women are heavily much more represented in smaller local offices and less as you go up sort of the chain of command, right? And there's a lot of sort of discussions around how do we get more women into office? Like, how do we encourage more women to run and support women running and so forth, so that we can actually create gender parity in the representation of government throughout the chain. So from local to state to national. And a big part about this is around eliminating underlying interconnected barriers that women face in getting elected, such as that, female candidates oftentimes have less money than male candidates. One, because just their own personal finances are less, but also, there's sort of weaker professional networks, as well as, denial of financing or sort of biases against them. There's also outside responsibilities that make it harder on for women to run. So in regards to other obligations like childcare and so forth, it's kind of hard if you are sort of the primary caregiver for children and so forth to then think about running for office and being able to run for office. So if we want to talk about getting more women to run, yes, it's about encouraging women and supporting women, but it's also about creating concrete policies that to support, for example, working parents or and especially working parents who want to serve on a local office or national office or so forth, to providing, better access to finances or personal connections, for women, right? The solution is not one solution, but one is to sort of address the fact that female candidates aren't running on an equal playing field, and so we need to really address these sort of systemic inequalities that women face that then prohibits them or limits them from running for office. So one last thing that I want to talk about in regards to the state, and the state again, I'm talking broadly speaking, so both that includes like the United States government, so the federal government, to state governments, to city governments, to and so forth. So the state, broadly speaking. I want to talk about state policies. So the state, whether you're talking about the federal government, state government, local, etc., has incredible amount of authority in determining people's rights and privileges. The state has the power to exclude and discriminate against groups and create policies in favor of certain other groups. We have a long history of doing this. And by maintaining this inequality, the state reflects the interests of the dominant groups in society and supports policies that work in their interests and reinforce their power. So let's sort of talk about this in a much more concrete example. Poverty. Poverty, which is something that many of us have experienced or witnessed or so forth, right? Now, it's very interesting to think about that poverty, which is such an intimate personal experience of living in poverty, is also something that is very much regulated by the state in the terms of how it sort of one frames poverty, and then also how it creates policies around poverty. So the federal government defines poverty strictly on a family's annual cash income rather than their total wealth, meaning that they just sort of look at the cash that they are coming in, not looking at just like the amount of wealth in total or how much it might cost in regards to cost of living or their own assessment of well-being. Like, you might be making a certain amount of money above the poverty level, but given the cost of living or the cost of food or the other sort of expenses you might have in regards to care, child care, and so forth, you might not be living well, but you would still not be defined as poor by the United States government. So The United States government divides poverty by, again, the money coming in and how many people are in your household. So for a one-person family or one-person household, the federal poverty level is around $12,000, meaning that if you make 12,000 so money or less, you are defined as poor by the U.S. government. And then this number, increases with each member of the family. So, like, you are an 8-person house, and you have an annual income, which means the whole family is bringing in just around $44,000. You are federally classified as being poor, which means, therefore, then when you have that sort of classification, you might be eligible for certain services. But again, this level is not taking into consideration any sort of cost the family might have in regards to cost of living, to other expenses like childcare, to other expenses in regards to other sort of things that might be happening to them in regards to healthcare or whatever. So there can be definitely plenty of families that technically earn more than what the federal poverty guideline is, but are living in poverty conditions because of many factors like healthcare, like childcare, and so forth. But unfortunately, the federal government only looks at your annual cash income, which means then there's a whole bunch of families that are struggling to survive who are not eligible for certain services as well as support. Women generally have higher poverty rates, with about 1 in 3, or about 13% of women across the country experiencing poverty. And a lot of that, as we talked about in regards to women in work, is due to the gender wage gap. That when women are technically working working the same hours but earning less, means that they have less money coming in. Therefore, and then they have expenses as well, which makes them oftentimes being in the poverty level. We also need to take into the fact that, as we talked about before, it's not just gender, but we need to intersect that with race. 23% of African Americans and also Native American women are living in poverty levels. 21% of Latinas and about 12% of Asian American women live in poverty. So it's a very gendered and racial sort of intersections into this. So this is a big, issue in regards to social services like welfare, right? So depending upon how the federal government classifies you, you might not be eligible. And if you are eligible, you might also be put through several other loopholes to get sort of social services needed for you under the welfare system. Poverty in the United States is powerfully structured by racial and gender inequalities, and patterns in income and wealth are strongly skewed along these lines. Women on welfare often face a triple whammy. They are facing, one, lower paid work, they are mothers with domestic responsibilities and childcare expenses, and they are single with only one paycheck. This can have a really big problem because having a job does not necessarily lift women out of poverty. It is also doesn't guarantee sufficient sort of other sort of resources if they need them in regards to healthcare, childcare, and so forth. In 1996, the Welfare Reform Act had a very negative effect on women because it requires recipients of welfare to get a job after receiving benefits for 2 years, and limits the duration of benefits paid by federal funds to 5 years over a person's lifetime. However, so basically, if you receive welfare, you need to in 2 years have a job. If not, you will not get it, and you're only allowed to receive welfare for up to 5 years. Now, this was meant to incentivize people to get back to work and so forth, but what it actually does is it causes more and more people to live in extreme forms of poverty because of the sort of gender and racial inequalities out there, as well as other sort of factors that make it hard for particularly women with children to be able to get enough high paying enough job in order for them to get out of poverty levels. So all of this whole lecture, whether we're talking about the state, to the Constitution, to state policies, you know, all of them fall along gender and racial lines. And you can't really talk about the government without talking about how it is very gendered and very racialized and impacts particularly those most marginalized within our society. If anything, as we go forward and are going to be part of the next election cycle, if anything, to encourage you to vote. I hope this does. But if anything, the power and representation, the power of trying to get more sort of voices at the table in regards to government policies and government from your local level to your state level to your national level is important. Because without these sort of plurality of voices or diversity of voices, those who are the most marginalized will not be represented and they will be further oppressed and marginalized. Okay, everybody. Thank you.